The silent stalker of Nome. The wind clawed at the edges of the cabin, rattling the old wooden shutters like skeletal fingers desperate to be let inside. Outside, the Alaskan night had folded into an endless black, a void so thick it felt almost tangible, pressing against my chest with every breath. The scent of pine and ice clung to the air, bitter and sharp, and somewhere in the distance, the hollow call of a lone raven echoed across the frozen expanse. I had come to Alaska thinking I could escape the noise of the world, but here, in this remote stretch of land where the aurora painted the sky in ghostly streaks of green and violet, I realized isolation didn't protect you. It made you vulnerable. It made you notice the sounds, the small, deliberate ones, that you would have otherwise ignored. The creak of the floorboards, the scrape of snow against the window, the faint shuffle of something just beyond the clearing. I could feel it watching, waiting. And then I heard it, the whisper that didn't belong to the wind. Officer Jackson Reed had been called to a derelict hunting cabin on the outskirts of Nome, a place long abandoned and whispered about by locals as cursed. The snowstorm outside had turned the landscape into a white void, and as he trudged through the knee-deep drifts, the world seemed to shrink until all he could see was the narrow beam of his flashlight. The first thing he noticed inside the cabin was the smell, coppery, sharp, like blood old and sour. He told himself it was just rusted metal, the decay of an old hunting lodge. But then he saw the tracks. Not human footprints, not animal either. Something large had circled the cabin, pressed down the snow in impossible patterns, as if testing him. Reed's breath fogged the cold air as he moved through the cabin, and with each creaking step, the floorboards seemed to sigh beneath him. Then, just as he was about to leave, he heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, threading through the darkness. "Go back." His hand tightened on his flashlight, swinging it across the room until it landed on a figure, or what he thought was a figure, huddled in the corner. It moved too fast, disappearing into the wall itself, leaving only a smear of frost behind, like something had slid into the ice. Reed stumbled back, heart pounding, and in the silence that followed, he realized the whisper hadn't come from the cabin. It had come from the snow outside, circling him, following him, patient and hungry. By morning, he was found standing in the snow, frozen in place, eyes wide, lips sealed, not a word escaping. They never found what had haunted him, only the tracks, hundreds of them, all leading into the void beyond Nome. Story 2. The Howling on Hatcher Pass. The wind never truly dies in Alaska. It merely shifts, carrying with it the cries of things you cannot see. Emily and her friends decided to escape Anchorage for a weekend, chasing the thrill of snowmobiling along the winding trails of Hatcher Pass. The sky had been bruised with storm clouds, and by the time they reached the ridge, the world was a grayscale nightmare. Snow drifts taller than their vehicles, trees bent under the weight of ice, and shadows that danced like they had lives of their own. Emily had always been sensitive to sounds, the kind that made the skin on your neck prickle, and that evening, the quiet was too perfect. It pressed in, muffling the roar of their engines, until a single sound tore through the silence. A low, drawn-out howl that didn't resemble any animal they knew. They followed it, curiosity outweighing caution, and found themselves at the edge of a ravine, where the snow had been churned into impossible ridges. The howl came again, this time closer, but there was no shape, no eyes reflecting their flashlights. Just the sound, twisting and bending as if the mountains themselves were mocking them. Then the first body appeared, a moose, massive and broken, lying face down in the snow, its legs twisted unnaturally. Emily swore she saw its head twitch, but no one else did. Panic set in as the howling multiplied, echoing off the cliffs like a choir of unseen predators. Their snowmobiles sputtered, engines cutting out, leaving them stranded in a world where visibility was measured in inches and fear was the only constant. Emily could feel it breathing around them, a wet, icy scent on her face, a pulse that wasn't hers. One by one, her friends vanished into the storm. She ran, slipping over frozen boulders, her lungs burning, until she stumbled into a clearing where the aurora stretched like a ribbon across the sky. And there, at the center, stood something upright in the snow, tall, impossibly thin, and staring. Its head tilted, mimicking her movements, and then, in one fluid motion, it darted into the darkness. Emily never saw her friends again, and the locals whispered afterward that the Howls were the mountains claiming souls who dared disturb them, a truth that made every wind-blown ridge afterward seem alive with invisible eyes. Story 3. The Shadow of Denali Lake. A forest in Alaska never truly sleeps. Daniel Harris, an experienced outdoorsman, had ventured alone to the far side of Denali Lake, drawn by the promise of solitude and the glint of untouched waters under the weak spring sun. The ice was melting, cracking in sudden, echoing pops that bounced off the cliffs like gunshots. At first, it was peaceful, the smell of wet pine, the soft murmur of water lapping against the banks. But as night fell, that serenity curdled into something else. Shapes moved in the tree line, long and dark, slipping between trunks without a sound. He told himself it was animals, bears, wolves, but instinct screamed differently. The shadows didn't run or hide. They watched. They waited. By the third night, Daniel had begun hearing voices, faint, murmuring, almost coaxing, weaving through the trees in a cadence that felt ancient. He chalked it up to fatigue, isolation, the lake playing tricks on him. Then he saw the first one. At the edge of his campsite, standing perfectly still, was a figure wrapped in shadows, taller than any man should be, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head swiveled slowly, observing him, yet its eyes were hollow, reflecting nothing. When Daniel tried to move, his legs froze, a paralysis that came not from fear alone but from the insistence of the forest itself. The figure didn't approach, it merely tilted its head, as though considering whether he was worth consuming, and then vanished into the dark like smoke. The next morning, the snow along the lake's edge bore tracks, impossible footprints that twisted in on themselves, weaving patterns like some ritual only the dark knew. Daniel left the lake in a hurry, feeling the presence following him all the way back to his cabin. Windows rattled at night, the whispers returned, and when he finally dared to speak of what he saw, locals only shook their heads. The lake keeps what it wants, they said, their eyes distant, haunted. Daniel never returned, but sometimes, hikers report a figure staring from the tree line, limbs bending wrong, head tilting, as if the lake's shadow itself remembers who walks near it, choosing those it will not let leave. Story 4. The Cabin Above the Valley. Marcus and Lena, newlyweds seeking adventure, had found what they thought was the perfect escape, a secluded cabin perched on a cliff above a frozen valley, far from the roads, far from anyone. From the moment they arrived, the air felt wrong, thick with a stillness that was almost tangible, as if the world had been held in suspense for centuries. Snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling sound and light, leaving only shadows that moved just beyond the firelight. The first night, as they huddled near the hearth, Lena thought she saw footprints in the snow outside the cabin, too small to belong to any man, yet too deliberate to be random. Marcus dismissed it as wind-blown debris or animal tracks, but Lena could feel the presence before she could see it, a cold, patient awareness that lingered in the corners of the room. By the second night, the cabin had changed. Objects shifted when they weren't looking, chairs slightly tilted, doors left ajar despite being locked. Lena heard breathing in the hall, low and rhythmic, as if something large had settled just beyond the door, watching. When she confronted Marcus, he shook his head, telling her it was the isolation playing tricks, but deep down, he felt it too, the oppressive watchfulness that made sleep impossible. That night, the wind roared louder than ever, rattling the walls, and the fire sputtered as if warning them. Lena woke to find Marcus gone. The room was empty, the window open, and fresh footprints pressed into the snow, leading toward the edge of the cliff. She screamed, heart pounding, but the snow swallowed the sound, the wind carrying it away into the endless white. By morning, the only trace left of him was a frozen glove at the cliff's edge, turned inside out, as though something had toyed with it. Lena left at first light, but the valley seemed alive behind her, watching, whispering, and she knew some presences did not forgive, and some cliffs claimed more than just the unwary. Story 5. The Frozen Children of Barrow. Mark and Sophia, a team of amateur explorers documenting abandoned sites along the northern coast, had ventured into the half-buried remnants of an old boarding school near Barrow. Doors rotted and windows shattered like the eyes of long-dead watchers. The moment they stepped inside, the cold became suffocating, seeping past coats, gloves, and scarves, as though the building itself inhaled their warmth. The air smelled of decay, old paint, and something metallic, like rusted chains or dried blood. In the main hall, faint scratches lined the walls, shallow yet deliberate, and in the corner, piles of tattered dolls stared with hollow eyes. At first, they laughed nervously, chalking the sounds they heard, footsteps in empty halls, whispers just out of earshot, to imagination. But the laughter died quickly when they found the classrooms. Tiny desks were tipped over, books scattered, their pages frozen stiff with frost, and on each surface, a child-sized handprint, pressed deep into the dust. The prints weren't random. They led down the hall, converging at the basement door. Mark hesitated, but curiosity won. The steps creaked as they descended, the darkness swallowing them, and then the whispers became voices. They spoke a language neither had heard, yet somehow understood, pleading, warning, chanting in unison. A single icy hand brushed Mark's shoulder, cold enough to burn. He spun around. Nothing. Only the echo of footsteps behind them, but these were not theirs. By the time they reached the basement, the air was so cold it seemed solid, pressing against their lungs. Shapes moved in the shadows, too small to be human, yet grotesquely elongated, crawling across the floor in jerky motions. Sophia screamed, and in an instant, the temperature dropped further, their breath crystallizing in the air. One of the shapes lunged, and Mark stumbled back into the stairs, almost falling. When they finally escaped into the blinding light of the frozen morning, the school appeared empty, silent, as if it had never awakened. Yet the locals knew better. The boarding school held what it had always held, lost children, twisted and trapped between ice and shadow, waiting for someone foolish enough to find them again. Story 6. The Vanishing Trail of Resurrection Creek. Jonah Pierce, an experienced hiker, had been chasing the thrill of untouched wilderness, seeking solitude along Resurrection Creek. The first day passed uneventfully, the sun bright on the snow, birds calling overhead, the creek gurgling beneath a thin layer of ice. But by nightfall, a dense mist rolled down the mountainside, settling into the valley like a living thing. Jonah tried to find his campsite, but the trail had vanished. Trees that were familiar an hour ago now loomed like walls, their branches clawing at the sky. Then he heard it, faint footsteps behind him. At first, he assumed another hiker had been on the trail, but as he spun around, he saw nothing but the fog, thick and moving as if it had a rhythm of its own. The sound followed, not directly, but in echoes, teasing him from every direction at once. Panic rose as he stumbled over roots hidden beneath the snow, and when he dared to call out, his voice seemed to vanish before reaching the air. Hours, or perhaps days, passed, he could no longer tell. In the fog, shapes appeared, fleeting but unmistakable, figures in tattered clothing, their faces obscured, moving with unnatural grace through the mist. One reached out a hand, skeletal and trembling, and Jonah felt an irresistible pull, as if the fog itself wanted him. He ran blindly, tripping over frozen roots and slipping on ice, until he collapsed near a cluster of boulders. When the fog finally lifted at dawn, the trail was gone. Jonor was found days later by a search party, wandering aimlessly along a different ridge, frostbitten, delirious, muttering about shadows and whispers that had guided him deeper into the forest. He could never describe exactly what he had seen, only that something in Resurrection Creek did not follow the rules of the living world. Locals now warn hikers, the creek doesn't just hide its trail, it hides the unwary, and the fog does not forget. Story 7. The Frozen Light of Eagle River. Lucas Whitman, a photographer drawn to the Northern Lights, had ventured alone to Eagle River, hoping to capture the celestial dance in its most vivid form. The snow underfoot was crunchy, the air sharp and metallic in his lungs. As night fell, the aurora shimmered, ribbons of green and violet stretching across the heavens like spilled liquid fire. At first, it was breathtaking, hypnotic even, but then the lights twisted unnaturally, shifting, elongating, as though responding to something below. Lucas felt a prickle at the back of his neck, a sensation of being observed, though he was alone in the frozen expanse. He noticed movement at the tree line, a figure crouched low, nearly blending with the snow, yet unmistakably human in silhouette. He raised his camera, trying to focus, but the lens fogged instantly. The figure was gone, and in its place were footprints, too large and irregular to be human, leading in circles that drew him closer to the riverbank. The aurora above pulsed, a rhythm synchronized with the faint thuds beneath his feet. He froze, realizing the sounds weren't his own, they were approaching. Shadows stretched unnaturally, coiling around the trees, creeping closer in a slow, deliberate hunt. Lucas turned to run, but the snow betrayed him, giving way to icy mud that swallowed his boots. He felt a cold grip on his shoulder, though nothing was there, and the aurora flared overhead in a blinding wave, revealing dozens of figures standing just beyond the river, their faces featureless, their eyes hollow voids reflecting the northern lights. He never saw the sunrise. When hikers discovered his camera weeks later, the last images captured him standing on the riverbank, frozen in mid-step, eyes wide with terror, and behind him, shadows that stretched impossibly, as if the night itself had leaned down to claim him. Locals speak in hushed tones of Eagle River, warning that some lights in the sky are not for wonder. They are predators, signals to the unseen, guiding travelers into the cold and leaving nothing but their echo in the snow. Story 8. The Drowned Watcher of Kuskokwim. Sam Ortega, a young fisherman, thought he knew the moods of the Kuskokwim River. Early spring had swollen it, ice chunks bobbing like driftwood, and the air smelled of wet soil and rot from thawing permafrost. Sam had set out before dawn, hoping to catch the day's first salmon, the river silent except for the occasional crack of breaking ice. But beneath the surface, something stirred. He felt it first in his hands, a tug against the line that was stronger, colder, heavier than any fish should be. When he leaned over the side of his boat, he saw a shadow moving just below the water, far too large, impossibly fast, vanishing before he could aim a light. By midday, the river's current had grown restless, whispering in hisses and gurgles that sounded almost human. Sam noticed footprints along the bank, wet, six-toed, leading upstream, though no one had passed in days. At night, as he camped beside the water, he swore he saw shapes in the shallows, humanoid, pale, limbs stretched in angles that could not be natural, watching him with eyes that glinted like wet stones. The river sang to him, pulling at his mind with a rhythmic pressure that made sleep impossible. He tried to leave, but the water refused him. His boat tipped inexplicably, or snapping in half, leaving him clinging to a floating log as the shapes in the shallows crept closer. When rescue finally arrived, Sam was found at the edge of the river, soaked and shivering, whispering warnings about the watcher beneath the ice. He claimed it followed him through the nights, that it waited in the deepest pools, patient and silent, and that anyone who dared fish its waters risked disappearing into the cold grip of the river forever. Locals nod, eyes dark, sharing tales of missing boats and fishermen who never return, leaving behind only ripples in the water and the haunting certainty that the Kuskokwim keeps its secrets alive, waiting, hungry, endless. Story 9. The Whispering Pines of Talkeetna. Claire Donovan, a botanist studying rare spruce in the Talkeetna Mountains, had always been fascinated by the way these trees seemed to pulse with life. She set up her research tent in a clearing, surrounded by ancient pines that towered like silent sentinels. At first, the forest was serene, the only sounds her boots crunching snow and the occasional caw of a raven. But soon, she noticed patterns in the wind, a faint, rhythmic whisper that followed her wherever she walked, like a voice attempting to mimic her own thoughts. At night, the whispering grew louder, weaving through the trees, echoing from impossible directions, always just behind her. One evening, she ventured deeper into the forest, following a trail she had never seen before, the snow underfoot surprisingly firm despite weeks of cold. The whispers began to take shape, forming words she could almost understand: warnings, pleas, threats. She froze when the shadows shifted, long and black, stretching across the snow in ways that defied logic. Between the trees, figures appeared, tall, thin, their limbs bending at wrong angles, faces pale and blank. They did not move toward her at first, only observed, tilting their heads in synchronization with the whispering. Panic rose, a roar, gnawing fear that made her stomach turn. When she tried to retrace her steps, the forest had changed. The path she knew had vanished, replaced by a maze of pines that seemed to close in on her, shifting with every heartbeat. Days later, searchers found her tent abandoned, snow packed tightly around it, footprints leading out but never returning. Claire was gone, and the locals said she had walked too far into the whispering pines, where time and reality bend, and the forest keeps those who linger too long. Travelers now speak of faint whispers in the Talkeetna snow, voices that echo your own thoughts, drawing you deeper, closer to the trees that watch, that remember, that do not forgive the curiosity of the living. Story 10. The Last Light of Iliamna. Nathaniel Cross, a wildlife photographer, ventured to the edges of Iliamna Lake, chasing the reflection of the mountains in the ice. The wind was sharp enough to cut skin, carrying the smell of wet stone and rot from thawing permafrost. There was a stillness here that didn't belong, a quiet that wasn't the absence of sound, but a pressure pressing against his skull, a suffocating awareness that he was not the first to arrive, and would not be the last. As the sun dipped low, painting the ice in gold, shadows began moving across the frozen expanse, too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be wind. He followed them, curiosity mingling with dread, and soon discovered the shoreline littered with remnants of old boats, torn nets, and frozen footprints that led nowhere. Each print seemed to pulse with a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, and the lake reflected shapes that were not his own. Then the whispers started, low, guttural, incomprehensible, but carrying a warning tone that pierced the cold like a knife. Nathaniel's camera captured flashes of figures just beyond vision, humanoid, yet grotesque, frozen in mid-motion, faces blank, limbs twisted. When he tried to retreat, the ice itself betrayed him, cracking beneath his boots, swallowing sound, bending reality. The shadows moved faster now, converging, circling, herding him toward the center of the lake. By the last light, Nathaniel's silhouette was all that remained visible, standing frozen as the aurora shimmered above, illuminating dozens of faceless watchers on the ice. When search parties arrived weeks later, they found nothing but a shattered camera and prints that led straight into the lake, vanishing without a trace. Locals say that Iliamna Lake does not forgive those who linger too long, that the shadows wait beneath the ice, patient and eternal. The wind over the frozen waters still carries whispers, low and urgent, and if you listen closely, you can hear the faintest echo of a man calling for help, Nathaniel, or perhaps the next one, swallowed by the lake, claimed by a cold that never forgets, never forgives, and never lets go.